For our flipped classroom session this week, we're going to look at the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1965 and look at other ways of interpreting civil rights. When we look at civil rights, we need to understand the federal background. In other words, we need to understand the events that led up to the marches and the civil rights demonstrations of the late 1950s and 1960s. Here I talk about psychologist Kenneth Clark's doll experiment in the 1940s. Clark gave dolls to young children, black dolls and white dolls, and found that children of both races, whether white or black, preferred the white dolls. And he concluded from this that society had socialized young people from the very earliest ages to prefer white to black, and that prejudice was deeply ingrained because of culture, because of how people were raised. And this was cited by the Supreme Court in the Brown versus Board of Education case to justify integration and the strikedown of segregation laws. This is an example of how the federal government was important to the background of civil rights. Now, we've already talked about these things, so we don't need to go into great detail about this. But you can see that World War II and the Cold War planted the seeds for the civil rights movement. In other words, what the Supreme Court did in 1954 was tell the states that they were disobeying the law when they practiced segregation. That should have caused the states to give way. However, the states refused to follow the court's orders, and therefore segregation continued in the South. And the Supreme Court did not have the power to enforce its own rules. It depended on the president to do that. And when it became clear that the president wouldn't do that, in May 1955, the Supreme Court issued its all deliberate speed implementation order, which simply meant that the states could comply with the law at their own pace. Well, at their own pace meant never. So, what were the pros and cons of the Brown decision? Well, it was a unanimous decision, and that sent a loud message that henceforth the Supreme Court had spoken, and that if you were in favor of segregation, you were going against the law of the land. Plessy versus Ferguson, which was overturned by the Brown decision, should never have been the law of the land in the first place. It had been the law of the land since 1896, enforcing segregation, but it should never have been in effect in the first place. The Brown decision helped eliminate America's schizoid problem, that is, the American dilemma. It indicated that America was going to choose its deepest ideals over segregation. That was good. It also helped the U.S. win the Cold War because it showed the United States moving towards equality, at least at the national level, not the state level. Well, the cons, of course, have to do with the implementation order. All deliberate speed meant never to the South. And the Brown order did trigger massive resistance in the South, so some historians question whether it was the right move at the right time. It was certainly the right move, but whether it was done at the right time has been a focus of some controversy, because the South rose up in wrath against the decision, and even Virginia, for example, closed its schools in the late 1950s rather than comply with integration. So it provoked a backlash which may have set back the cause of civil rights for a few years. It also entangled civil rights individuals in America's Red Scare. The opponents of integration could claim, not very well, but to some Americans they sounded persuasive, they could claim that civil rights individuals were communists because they were criticizing America. And in the time period of the 1950s, that was a hard accusation to throw off. But you have the grassroots take off. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1956, Otterine Lucy tries to integrate the University of Alabama, the first black student who was admitted to that university. There was a mob that stopped her from enrolling In 1957, Eisenhower sent federal paratroopers to enforce a court order that a black student should be admitted to Central High School in Little Rock. But from 1957 to 1960, Congress dithered and Ike dallied. Congress did not do anything effective to promote civil rights, nor did Eisenhower. Therefore, the grassroots had to intervene. When I say the grassroots, I mean local people taking action in their own hands, usually nonviolent civil disobedience, and shining the spotlight of injustice on segregation. In 1960, you have the sit-ins in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina. And in 1961, you had the Freedom Rides, which were met by segregationist violence through the South. The Freedom Rides, of course, being people riding the buses in an integrated manner through the South and provoking a violent reaction. John F. Kennedy promised to be for civil rights, but he temporized. That is, he did not show much support for civil rights. So it was necessary for the nonviolent civil disobedience movement to provoke the South and to generate support from the White House that otherwise would not have been there. What actions won civil rights? This is the key question. Was it national heroes or local people? And you need to make a decision for this assignment. If you look at these bullet points, you see that many local heroes, local people, not the big shots like Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, were vital for the success of civil rights. Take a look at E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, Cliff and Virginia Durr, and the Montgomery bus boycott. We'll say a few words about them. What about Diane Nash and the Freedom Rides? What about James Meredith and the integration of Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, in 1962? What about the actions of the President, John Kennedy, in 1963? What brought about passage of that law? It doesn't seem to have been Kennedy's activism, but rather it seems to have been Kennedy's death on November 22, 1963, which promoted the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Then in 1964, you have Freedom Summer, the attempt by white college students to register blacks in the South to vote. They were murdered by Southern mobs, and the three who were most famous that were killed were Michael Schwerner, James Goodman, and a fellow named James Chaney. Andrew Goodman and James Chaney were their names. Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. The first two were white, the third was black, but they were college students who were lynched, essentially, murdered for trying to register blacks to vote. This was one of the things that pushed civil rights forward because it generated great sympathy on the part of the solid middle class in the North. Then in 1965, of course, you have the Selma March. John Lewis and Unitarian Universalist minister James Reeb marched in Selma, and the television cameras caught it all, and they especially caught the fact that the white policemen beat up the demonstrators, and one of the mob members in the crowd beat up and beat to death James Reeb. So what this did is it caused a tremendous surge of sympathy on the part of white opinion in the North for civil rights. Television, the support of the white middle class majority, this is what caused civil rights to succeed. And the question is, who brought about that dynamic? Was it these local heroes, or was it people like Martin Luther King and the presidents? So what of the great man's school? There's a lot to be said for Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King skillfully wove the best of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois into one powerful tapestry, a nonviolent now. In other words, King said that America could be trusted to live up to its ideals. and that the way to do that was through nonviolent demand for immediate receipt of those rights. So, unlike Washington, MLK did not want to go slow. And unlike W.E.B. Du Bois, King was confident that the law would be on the side of civil rights. So he wanted action now like W.E.B. Du Bois, but he wanted it nonviolently, like Booker T. Washington. So that was a powerful combination. MLK was both a powerful orator and a writer. He was a singularly great leader, one of the great leaders of American history. Martin Luther King used television skillfully. For example, the Birmingham demonstration provoked Bull Connor to send out the police dogs against the demonstrators, and that won over the white middle class consensus. As for LBJ, he was singularly effective in bending Congress to his will. Without LBJ, there would have been no civil rights or voting rights. And LBJ was effective in manipulating Congress, whereas JFK had not been. So there is much to be said for the great man's school in civil rights, and you will have to do a little research and decide which side you agree with. Another argument is what of the time frame argument? What was the main period of civil rights? Was it the period from 1955 to 1964? That's what this slide shows arguing. But there's evidence for the period before Brown, 41 to 55, as the crucial time period for civil rights. We talked about the federal government's actions during that time. And what about the argument that the main time frame of civil rights was after LBJ? You have the awakening of northern black America with the riots, Malcolm X. Why were blacks rioting in the North right after the achievements of the civil rights movement? Well, because northern blacks could see that legal equality was one thing and economic equality was quite another thing. And the gains were primarily being made in the South, not in the North. They could see with the TV commercials of their time what wonderful material comforts white Americans were enjoying, and they were not. And this was the first time in history when poor people, because of television, had an opportunity to see what they were not receiving. So that generated a great deal of pressure for civil rights. And yet, since 1965, we've seen the continuance of poverty, prison, and discrimination, as black Americans are the subject of police misconduct at times, and certainly are incarcerated to a greater extent than other Americans. So there is an argument that the main period of civil rights has to be after 1965 because it still is needed today. Your assignment is to take the position of either the Great Man School or the Local Hero School, being most pivotal to the achievement of civil rights. Write about your subject, that is, that you believe that the Great Man School is correct or the Local Hero School is correct, that local heroes were more important than great men or vice versa. Write about your subject explaining in a post of 2 paragraphs of 6 sentences each their necessity to the success of the episode you choose related to them. So, for example, if you believe in the Local Hero School, you would have to talk about some local hero who was pivotal to the success of civil rights in a single episode. If you believe in the Great Man School, you would talk about why that person was pivotal and you identify the person. Then you must also respond to one post by someone who takes the opposite view. If you take the local hero view, you have to respond to a post of someone who holds the great man view. Explain in 1 paragraph of 6 sentences why you disagree with the argument of the post to which you are responding. You must do both to win your points for this discussion assignment for this flipped classroom.